And we go on with materialism, naturalism presumes too much of science. Our second response to materialism, naturalism is that the scientific method is not actually as powerful as materialists and naturalists assume it to be. The scientific method makes sense of only a material world where the things observed can be explained by natural processes. To say that anything outside of what science can study does not exist is like saying that a lake is only 20 feet deep because that's how long our measuring tape is. In fact, if only what can be measured using the scientific method exists, then wouldn't we have to say that the scientific method itself doesn't exist, as it cannot itself be measured, observed, or repeated? Explaining all of reality is a burden far too heavy for science to carry. Even Julian Huxley, one of the 20th century's leading evolutionists, recognized the limited nature of the scientific method, and he said, "Science has removed the obscuring veil of mystery from many phenomena, much to the benefit of the human race. But it confronts us with a basic and universal mystery, the mystery of existence in general, and of the existence of mind in particular. Why does the world exist? Why is the world stuff what it is? Why does it have mental or subjective aspects as well as material or objective ones? We do not know." Very few scholars today would agree that we can know only that which can be studied with the scientific method. Historical facts, logical arguments, sociological observations, and aesthetic judgments are also accepted as evidence, and as we will see, evidence of all of these sorts has been shown to lend credibility to many key Christian beliefs. Materialism and naturalism explains too little about reality. Our third response to materialism and naturalism is that even if we assume that science could do all that materialists and naturalists say it can, it has very little to say about what makes life worth living or societies worth living in. It cannot explain why humans want to be free or why society should preserve liberty. It cannot explain why we find life valuable or why the law should protect it. It cannot explain human happiness or why the pursuit of happiness should be considered an inalienable right, as the American Declaration of Independence says. Still, people often just assume that materialism and naturalism are true. They live with what philosopher Charles Taylor refers to as an immanent frame. If I can't see it, hear it, or feel it, it doesn't exist. In his massive and acclaimed text, A Secular Age, Taylor points out that this modern bias toward materialism and naturalism is an unquestioned assumption, not a justified conclusion. Materialism and naturalism prizes the kind of knowledge that we can individually possess, but as Taylor points out, if we begin our inquiries with I, rather than we or God, we will arrive at very different and not necessarily better conclusions. Clearly, science has dramatically increased human knowledge, and it offers a useful and powerful means for knowing a good many things, but it is not effective in explaining all of reality. Science simply does not replace religion, as many materialists and naturalists suppose. Someone who says science replaces religion isn't making a statement of fact, but rather is revealing how narrow his or her framework is for understanding reality. According to Professor of Political Science Hunter Baker, what happened in the matter of science and religion was the creation of a legend. Dualism explains the world better. Our fourth response to materialism and naturalism is to call into question the very idea that believing that reality is only material and that it can be explained through natural processes alone is valid. Monism, or mono for Greek meaning one, monism is how I pronounce it, sorry. It comes from mono, the Greek word for one, is the belief that ultimately reality consists of one thing. For some, this may be the world of spirit, as in pantheism. For others, it may signify that only the material world exists. Dualism, however, see the duo, that is Greek for two, holds that reality is ultimately composed of two essential substances. Mind-body dualism says that human beings are composed of immaterial minds and material bodies. According to this species of dualism, a soul or other immaterial entity is just as real as the physical body to which it is united. What happens in the mind has physical consequences, and vice versa. For most of the 20th century, materialists and naturalists believed their viewpoint to be the only correct one, but this is changing. Contrary to materialists and naturalists' triumphant proclamations, the world is becoming more religious, not less. And although materialists and naturalists may count among their ranks those who have jumped ship from theism to atheism, there have been many prominent conversions the other way, including one of the world's most notorious atheists, Anthony Flew, who recanted his atheism in There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And in his book, Mind and Cosmos, renowned atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel stunned the academic world by announcing his newfound skepticism of materialism. He said it is prima facie, highly implausible that life as we know it is the result of a sequence of physical accidents together with the mechanism of natural selection. 2, we can hardly dismiss the anthology of essays from leading experts called Rethinking Secularism. In it, several authors question the validity of the assumption that God is irrelevant to what's important in life, which is one thing nearly all materialists and naturalists believe. Verifiable experiences demonstrate the insufficiency of materialism and naturalism. Our 5th response to the materialist-naturalist challenge is that many things seemingly occur in the world for which materialist and naturalist arguments simply do not account for the data that has and is continuing to be collected by reasonable observers. The evidence for near-death experiences, known as NDEs, is a surprising area of research challenging the belief that only the natural world exists. Recently, Eben Alexander, a respected neurosurgeon, wrote of having personally experienced a disease through which, according to hospital records, he suffered brain death, but then revived. His experiences during that time caused Alexander to re-examine the evidence for near-death experiences, after which he concluded that materialist and naturalist explanations are simply insufficient. Philosopher Gary Habermas has also rigorously studied such experiences and concluded that when it comes to explaining such things as near-death experiences, naturalism is the odd man out. Near-death experience stories are often sensational accounts that result in significant life changes for people who experience them. Profound life changes ought to get our attention, but often their sensational nature causes skeptics to immediately dismiss them. Near-death experience researchers have learned not to be so quick to scoff, rather separating out the traveling through a tunnel and seeing a bright light kind of stories, and focusing instead on the well-documented cases in which people who experienced brain death reported going places and seeing things they simply could not have known in their death state, such as what meal was being cooked at their home or what objects were on the roof of the hospital. Near-death experience claims have their doubters, as you might expect. One person actually created a God helmet to simulate experiences people say they have when encountering God. Just because it is possible to stimulate the brain to perceive God experiences, however, does not mean such experiences never have a supernatural origin. Scientists can stimulate the brain to experience sexual desire, but this does not mean there is no such thing as genuine love. Doubtless, the brain is a part of our experiences, but this does not sufficiently demonstrate that our experiences are only brain activity. In this section, we've introduced responses to materialist and naturalist assumptions. But belief in the supernatural does not prevail just because the arguments for materialism and naturalism are inadequate. And Christianity in particular needs to show that we ought not just believe in the generically supernatural, but in Jesus Christ as the God-man whose very life showed that God is active in the world and whose conquering of death and evil releases humanity from the fear of both. In this, it would be helpful to have evidence that can be explored with the tools of inquiry accepted among scholars. As it turns out, just such evidence is available for one of the most extraordinary events in all of history, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Section 4, Positive Evidence for the Supernatural, the Resurrection of the Son of God. As we have already seen, the biblical account is remarkably well supported for having been recorded so long ago. When it comes to the life of Christ, leading scholars such as early 20th century archaeologist William F. Albright were convinced that the New Testament books were written soon after the events they described and by people matching the characteristics of those said to have written them. Further, the books of the Bible survive through time remarkably uncorrupted. Gleason L. Archer Jr., for example, reported that even though copies of Isaiah discovered in Qumran Cave 1 near the Dead Sea in 1947 were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscript previously known, they were word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling. Though it is not necessary for the Bible to have been transmitted accurately for the miracles it reports to have been true, it is comforting to Christians to see how Bible writers took great care in transmitting their heritage faithfully. Harvard's Simon Greenleaf, still respected as a great 19th century expert on the common law, believed that the competence of the New Testament documents would be established in any court of law. Many of the Bible's claims are also established by completely secular sources. Jesus is treated as a historical figure even by early secular historians, including Josephus, who wrote about Jesus at least twice in his Antiquities of the Jews. This was in AD 93. Another early historian, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, wrote about AD 112 about the persons commonly called Christians, and also stated, Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the region of Tiberias. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. According to American biblical scholar Bruce Metzger, the early non-Christian testimonies concerning Jesus, though scanty, are sufficient to prove, even without taking into account the evidence contained in the New Testament, that he was a historical figure who lived in Palestine in the early years of the first century, that he gathered a group of followers about himself, and that he was condemned to death under Pontius Pilate. Today, no competent scholar denies the historicity of Jesus. Even secular historian Will Durant accepted the historicity of Jesus and called him, in the spiritual sense, the greatest revolutionist in history. 2, we must remember what we learned in chapter 3, that the miracles reported in the Bible have stood up under empirical examination. Extensive studies of the gospel miracles have found that between half and 3/4 of the miracle accounts include enough detail to conclude that the historical scene they described could, in fact, have occurred as reported. Enough evidence exists that it would be irresponsible to dismiss claims of the miraculous out of a mere bias against supernaturalism. For the purposes of this chapter, though, let's turn our attention to the one miracle central to the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The Apostle Paul, Christianity's earliest and most successful evangelist, treated the resurrection as the basis for Christianity's validity. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. That's from 1 Corinthians 15. Paul was not alone in emphasizing the resurrection centrality among the gospel writers. Luke carefully situated the crucifixion and resurrection narrative in a current events context, mentioning people whose existence and testimony could have been easily verified, such as Pilate, Caesar, Herod, Barabbas, and Joseph of Arimathea. Luke is very concerned with this sort of historical approach and describes Christ's resurrection as a real event in history. Section 5, Evidence for the Resurrection, the Minimal Facts Approach. So, was the resurrection a real event? Many scholars think so, and their careful examination of the resurrection seems to have led to an abandonment of serious efforts to disprove it. Much of this is due to the persistent lifelong work of a philosopher referenced earlier, Gary Habermas. Habermas, a professor at Liberty University, calls his methodology the minimal facts approach and presents it in a book co-authored with Michael Licona. He says, when presenting the evidence for the resurrection, let's stick to the topic of Jesus' resurrection. This means that we do not digress into a side discussion on the reliability of the Bible. While we hold that the Bible is trustworthy and inspired, we cannot expect the skeptical non-believer with whom we are dialoguing to embrace this view. So in order to avoid a discussion that may divert us off of our most important topic, we would like to suggest that we adopt a minimal facts approach. This approach considers only those data that are so strongly attested historically that they are granted by nearly every scholar who studies the subject, even the rather skeptical ones. Most facts we use meet two criteria. They are well evidenced, and nearly every scholar accepts them. We present our case using the lowest common denominator of agreed upon facts. This keeps attention on the central issue instead of sidetracking into matters that are irrelevant. This way we can present a strong argument that is both supportable and compelling. So, although Habermas does not reject the truth of the Bible as a whole, when it comes to studying the resurrection, he moves beyond questions of the Bible's inspiration or trustworthiness in order to focus on evidence and basic facts that even skeptics acknowledge as legitimate. Habermas's approach is different from the appeal to the majority approach of asking what a majority of biblical scholars might believe. After all, just because a bunch of people believe something doesn't make it true. However, if there are facts that the majority of scholars accept, and if these facts, when taken together, point to a conclusion, then we should take that evidence seriously. So, what are these minimal facts? First, Jesus died by crucifixion. Michael Licona points out that many sources, both Christian and non-Christian, report Jesus' execution, including the four Gospels and the works of Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and Mara bar Serapion. I don't know that. Each of these authors was familiar with crucifixion and knew the chances of surviving it were at best extremely bleak. Licona concludes the unanimous professional medical opinion is that Jesus certainly died due to the rigors of crucifixion, and even if Jesus had somehow managed to survive crucifixion, it would not have resulted in the disciples' belief that he had been resurrected. Side note, what they're saying is, if Jesus had been alive, not killed by the crucifixion, he would have been on the point of death, and you would describe him as barely alive or clinging to life or holding on to breath. Not he's resurrected, he's risen, which gives you the whole idea that he is whole and well and moving and speaking as though he were never crucified. So that's just the difference there. Second, Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. Paul, and remember, these are the minimal facts. Paul testifies to the fact that the disciples believed and claimed it. You can find this in 1 Corinthians. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, meaning they're dead. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. In this passage, Paul seems to recite a sort of creed that probably dated back to before his conversion in the immediate aftermath of Christ's resurrection. Scholars agree that 1 Corinthians was an early book, probably written in the AD 50s at a time when there were potentially many hundreds of people alive who could verify its core truths. Clearly, the disciples underwent a radical transformation following Jesus' resurrection. They believed so deeply that Jesus had risen from the dead that they devoted the rest of their lives to testifying about it. Lots of people have died for their convictions, but as Habermas points out, Jesus' disciples were in the right place to know the truth or falsity of the event for which they were willing to die. People often die for what they believe to be true, but it is a rare thing indeed for someone to willingly die for what he knows to be false. Third, the Apostle Paul was radically converted. What explained the transformation of Paul from highly esteemed persecutor of Christians to promoter of the Christian message? Only one thing. He believed he had seen Jesus. Of course, people convert from one belief to another all the time, but Paul's case was different. Habermas and Lacona explain. People usually convert to a particular religion because they have heard the message of that religion from a secondary source and believe the message. Paul's conversion was based on what he perceived to be a personal appearance of the risen Jesus. Today, we might believe that Jesus rose from the dead based on secondary evidence, trusting Paul and the disciples who saw the risen Jesus. But for Paul, his experience came from primary evidence. The risen Jesus appeared directly to him. He did not merely believe based on the testimony of someone else. Therefore, the difference is primary versus secondary sources. For most, belief is based on secondary sources. And even when religious belief is based on primary grounds, no other founder of a major religion is believed to have been raised from the dead, let alone have provided any evidence for such an event. Fourth, the skeptic James, brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. Gospel accounts indicate that Jesus' brothers, including James, were unbelievers who did not hold to the truth of Jesus' message. In the book of Acts, however, James is mentioned as one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. What happened? The ancient creed we referred to earlier mentions Jesus' appearing to James. Simply put, James apparently converted to Christianity because he believed that Jesus appeared to him after rising from the dead. How much did he believe this? Well, according to Habermas and Lacona, his beliefs in Jesus and his resurrection were so strong that he died as a martyr because of them. James' martyrdom is attested by Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria. We no longer have any of the works of Hegesippus or the writings of Clement where the event is mentioned. However, sections have been preserved by Eusebius. Therefore, his martyrdom is attested by both Christians and non-Christian sources. It is difficult to explain these facts apart from the resurrection. Where did Jesus' body end up? Why were so many changed? And why did they all risk their lives? There simply isn't a sufficient naturalistic answer. Just a minute. Section break. Need a drink. Moving on. Section 6. Additional evidence for the resurrection. There are also other compelling arguments scholars have advanced that, although not meeting the minimal facts criteria, are nonetheless intriguing. First, the tomb was empty. This conclusion is slightly less attested by the majority of scholars, but it is still a powerful piece of evidence because Jesus' execution was a public event. If Jesus' body had still been in the tomb, it would have been easy for his enemies to display the corpse and expose the claims of resurrection to be a hoax. Also, if it's not only Jesus' friends who report the empty tomb, but also Jesus' enemies, from all the available evidence, the tomb was empty. Here's something more. The emptiness of the tomb was first witnessed by women. In the Near Eastern culture of Jesus' time, in both Jewish and Roman traditions, the testimony of women was not considered strong evidence. William Lane Craig says, if the empty tomb story were a legend, then the male disciples would have been made to be the ones who discover the empty tomb. The fact that women, whose testimony was deemed worthless, were the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb can only be plausibly explained if, like it or not, they actually were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the Gospels faithfully record what for them was a very embarrassing fact. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright examined the evidence for the empty tomb and said, we are left with the secure historical conclusion. The tomb was empty. I regard this conclusion as coming in the same category of historical probability so high as to be virtually certain as the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is a powerful statement from a respected scholar whose book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, is must reading for anyone wanting to seriously examine the evidence for the resurrection. Second, more than 500 people witnessed the resurrected Christ. You'll find that in 1 Corinthians 15, including Mary, Peter, and 10 other apostles, and it changed their lives. These witnesses were so moved by the resurrection that they committed their lives to it and to the one whose divinity and righteousness it vindicated. The disciples did not abandon Christ, as they might have, because death by crucifixion was, according to their expectations, a sure sign of a failed Messiah, but instead were willing to die for the gospel they were proclaiming because the resurrection absolutely defied their expectations. Indeed, the resurrection of Christ took a group of scared and skeptical men and transformed them into courageous evangelists who proclaimed that resurrection in the face of threats on their lives. It must have taken quite a life-shaping event to do that. How do non-believers respond to this evidence? The most common response is that the disciples genuinely believed all this because they were hallucinating. But as Lacona points out, this explanation simply does not hold water. Since a hallucination is an event that occurs in the mind of an individual and has no external reality, one person cannot participate in another's hallucination. In this sense, they are like dreams. I could not wake my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream that I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep, come join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation. We might go back to sleep and both dream that we were in Hawaii, but we would not be participating in the same dream during the same activity, in the same location, and carrying on the same discussion with precisely the same words. This is because a dream occurs in the mind of an individual and has no corresponding external reality. Hallucinations are similar in that sense as a psychological phenomenon. In fact, Lacona points to the research of Dr. Gary Sibsey, a clinical psychologist who has studied the possibility of group hallucinations. Sibsey says, I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades, and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination, that is, an event for which more than one person purportedly shared in a visual or other sensory perception where there was clearly no external referent. Still, even if the disciples hallucinated, faulty sight doesn't change the facts. The tomb was empty, and hundreds of people apparently saw Jesus alive. Third, the theology of the disciples was drastically changed. Apart from the resurrection, the disciples' theology makes no sense at all. Nothing short of a miracle could have so radically altered the theology they had grown up with all their lives. William Lane Craig explains, Jews had no conception of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Messiah was supposed to be a triumphant figure who would command the respect of Jew and Gentile alike, and who would establish the throne of David in Jerusalem. A Messiah who failed to deliver and to reign, who was defeated, humiliated, and slain by his enemies, is a contradiction in terms. Nowhere do Jewish texts speak of such a Messiah. Therefore, it's difficult to overemphasize what a disaster the crucifixion was for the disciples' faith. Jesus' death on the cross spelled the humiliating end for any hopes they had entertained that he was the Messiah. But the belief in the resurrection of Jesus reversed the catastrophe of the crucifixion. Clearly, something immensely powerful happened that the disciples immediately developed a whole new theological tradition for which they were mocked, persecuted, and even put to death by both Jewish and Roman authorities. The Bible is clear about what this something is. Christ had risen from the dead. As New Testament scholar N.T. Wright puts it, the widespread belief and practice of the early Christians is only explicable if we assume that they all believed that Jesus was bodily raised in an Easter event, something like the stories the Gospels tell. The reason they believed that he was bodily raised is because the tomb was empty, and over a short period thereafter they encountered Jesus himself, giving every appearance of being bodily alive once more. The resurrection of Christ seriously challenges those who attempt to explain all reality through materialism, and it provides enticing evidence of a supernatural event that changed hundreds of lives instantly and billions more ever since. Let's take a moment to review. So far, we've seen that the bias against miracles is an assumption about the way the world works that simply does not hold up. The evidence for miracles, especially in the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus, is strong. What is the impact of all this evidence? Like the disciples, we are enabled to be more firmly committed to believing that the gospel is true and spreading its good news. But it is more than that. Having confidence in the miraculous accounts of the Bible enables us to see with complete clarity that God is powerful today and operating in the world to empower us to live like Christ and resist evil. As we'll discuss in a future chapter, I have found as a teacher that whenever the subject of miracles comes up, the question of evil follows quickly on its heels. People ask, what about supernatural evil, such as Satan and demons? Although it is not a central issue we are covering in this book, the reality of the existence of supernatural evil and Jesus' power over it is too big of a topic to ignore. First, we need to understand what it is, then see how Jesus conquers it, and finally discern how we ourselves might pursue good and resist evil in our own world today. And I'll stop there for a minute.